Many years ago, years before the MTA existed, before most of us had even met, I was in an online discussion forum with some of the future founders of the MTA, where we were engaging with some critics of Mormonism. And one of the critics asked whether any of us had ever seen angels. And Lincoln answered yes. I've told some of you already what happened to me when I read that. It was not that I was persuaded by an argument. It was that something in me opened. I had a powerful spiritual experience that ever since I've compared with the experience of Elisha's servant. So the same Elisha that Lincoln referred to had a servant who looked out at a besieging army and was despairing. And Elisha prayed, "Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see." And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. My eyes were opened to see the world in a way that let me recognize my fellow human beings as angels, to see Christ in them. This is not when I became a transhumanist. That would come later. But there was something about Lincoln's answer and the conversation that the rest of us were having around it that opened a way of seeing that has deepened over the 25 plus years since then. I've often told people that what we're doing in the MTA is reconciling faith and science, and we are doing that. But somewhere in the development of and in my own internalizing of Mormon transhumanism, I discovered it was also doing something else to me. I began to experience the world differently. Reconciliation, it turned out, has a phenomenology, a felt texture, something it is to be like. So here's what I want to argue today. Mormon transhumanism is, among other things, a project of re-enchantment. And it may be the most intellectually honest re-enchantment available. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about what disenchantment is and what it has cost humanity. And then about why most of the available re-enchantments on offer leave something to be desired. I'll talk a little bit about what Mormonism already brings to the table that makes it strangely well suited for this moment. And then about what Mormon transhumanism specifically contributes that I don't see anywhere else. And I want to invite you into this way of seeing. A century ago, the German sociologist Max Weber gave a phenomenon a name. He called it Entzauberung in German, the disenchantment of the world. And he meant not simply that people had stopped believing in God, but that the world had been culturally rendered as something to be calculated, predictable, mechanical, stripped of mysterious or incalculable forces. And the world became available to be treated as a tool, something to be dissected and manipulated and used. More recently, the Catholic philosopher Charles Taylor deepened this story. He wrote a book called A Secular Age, and he describes this shift from what he calls the porous self to the buffered self. He says the pre-modern person was porous, open to the cosmos, vulnerable to it, and constituted by what flowed into them from outside: spirits, graces, influences, meaning. But the modern person is buffered, sealed inside what he calls the immanent frame. So it's the assumption that meaning is something that minds project onto the world rather than something that the world carries. And so even for those of us who believe, belief feels like one option among many rather than the water we swim in. And I want to hold on to that porous self and come back to it later because we're going to want it back. But we're going to want it back in a defensible way, a way that we can defend in 21st century philosophy. So what does this disenchantment cost us as humanity? It's not exactly unhappiness, but it's more like a sort of a homelessness. It's like an awe without somewhere to address it. You look up at the night sky, you feel something rise within you, but you have nowhere to send it. The universe is about nothing in particular, and selves have to manufacture meaning in private because the cosmos stopped providing any. And lots of people have noticed this problem, and they've provided a variety of proposals for re-enchantment. I'm going to run through a few of them. I want to talk about what each of them gets right, but also why each of them falls short. So there is a romantic option. So this is like nature mysticism, the sublime, Wordsworth and Emerson and Mary Oliver, finding awe in sunsets and mountains and wild places. And there's a related move from within science, quantum strangeness, cosmological fine-tuning, the overwhelming scale of deep space and deep time that made Carl Sagan's voice tremble. And both of these preserve something real. The world can still rise up and meet us, and it's stranger and more astonishing than the dead mechanism picture ever suggested. But in both cases, this buffered self that's admiring this is still buffered. You get this feeling, and sometimes a very powerful feeling, but you don't get a cosmos. The awe has no theology. It doesn't tell you what the universe is for or what it asks of you. Panpsychism and the teleological revival are, to my mind, the most serious secular re-enchantments on offer today. Thinkers like Galen Strawson, Philip Goff, Alfred North Whitehead, Charles Sanders Peirce, Thomas Nagel, they're reopening questions that modern philosophy had declared closed. Whether consciousness is fundamental, whether mind and purpose are real features of the universe, whether the materialist neo-Darwinian picture is simply incomplete. This work, once again, gives us a cosmos that can feel, and even a cosmos that might lean in a particular direction, but it still does not quite give us a cosmos that loves, or calls, or asks something of us. It's rigorous and it's important, and Mormon transhumanism should claim it as a fellow traveler, but it's not the whole thing. There is a great well of Eastern traditions, Buddhist non-dualism, Taoist immanentism, Vedantic monism, that never inherited these Western dualisms, and so they never had quite the same disenchantment problem. They do offer a powerful vision, a cosmos where mind and matter are not divided, where awareness is not an accident, where the deepest reality of the self and the world are one. Many of us have learned from them. But their characteristic move is to resolve that unity by dissolving the self. The individual in the end becomes something to be seen through. And what is lost is something Mormonism insists on, the irreducibility and eternity of persons in relationship. And a re-enchantment that costs us the person is not the one I'm after. And then there's religious re-enchantment by retreat. So biblical literalism or anti-modernism, much of things that get called spiritual but not religious. And these things buy enchantment, but it's at the cost of intellectual seriousness, or by privatizing meaning until it makes no claims on the cosmos at all. So each of these gives us something of what disenchantment took, but none of them gives us everything we want. A world that is intelligible, intentional, moral, embodied, and something that we play a role in. It's ours to participate in all at once and without asking us to lie about what we know. So we're not just after meaning, we're after a world that can carry meaning honestly. And Mormonism, almost uniquely among the religions of the modern West, has been curiously well equipped for this moment from the beginning, and it takes significant steps in the right direction. Joseph Smith in section 131 of the Doctrine and Covenants says, "There's no such thing as immaterial matter. All spirit is matter, but it is more fine or pure and can only be discerned by purer eyes." In that sentence, Joseph dissolves the metaphysical wall that did most of the work of this disenchantment in the West. Spirit is not a different substance hiding behind the world. It is the world, more finely constituted. The God of Mormonism is an embodied, becoming God, not the unmoved mover of classical theism, not an impassible absolute outside time. Beings within the cosmos, subject to its laws and exalted by them. And I would argue this is not a departure from the Christian tradition. It's an intensification of its most startling claim, Christ's incarnation. God entering nature, subject to its laws and exalted by them. Christ is the paradigm case. And then there's the King Follett discourse. that Lincoln mentioned before, Joseph Smith's last General Conference discourse, April 1844, just weeks before his death. You have got to learn how to be gods yourselves, and to be kings and queens and priests and priestesses to God, the same as all gods have done before you, namely by going from one small degree to another, from a small capacity to a great one, from grace to grace, from exaltation to exaltation. This is a claim about what the universe is for. The cosmos has a telos, a purpose. The multiplication of divine persons in eternal relation, and we are inside that process. There's no metaphysical chasm. There's just a long road of becoming, even beyond the grave, and we're on it, walking the road that Christ walked first. And that road leads to divine sociality, the council in heaven, the inherently relational character of exaltation, sealing as ontology and not just metaphor. Meaning is not a property of isolated minds, it's a property of community that extends in principle across all that exists. Then there's the temple. Mormons do not always appreciate how strange and how powerful our temple practice is. The temple is not primarily a place of instruction or worship in the usual sense. It's a place where the cosmos is enacted. In the endowment, participants do not merely learn about the creation of the world and the exaltation of humanity. They take their place inside the story. They perform the roles. They are addressed as the primal human beings and as their own future divine selves. Sealings are not metaphors for relationships that exist somewhere else. They are ontological acts that bind real persons across real time. The temple is cosmological theater in the deepest sense, a ritual rehearsal of a re-enchanted cosmos that we're not just describing but practicing into being. Long before any of us had ever heard the word transhumanism, Mormon temple worship was already saying the work of the cosmos is the linking of persons across all time, the elevation of intelligence into glory, and the performance of that work is something we do with our bodies in community now. And crucially, Mormonism is natively pragmatist. Joseph Smith's epistemology is try it and see. If any of you lack wisdom, ask of God and you shall receive. Brigham Young's theology is relentlessly practical, suspicious of creeds, oriented to what actually works in building Zion. Moroni's promise, it's a pragmatist test in scriptural form, as is Alma's invitation to plant the seed of faith. Long before Peirce coined the term, the Restoration was already operating on the assumption that the meaning of an idea is the difference it makes in practice, and that truth is what survives faithful experiment. This is not a coincidence. This is a deep structural affinity, and it's one reason why American pragmatism and Mormonism keep finding each other. So Mormonism never fully bought disenchantment in the first place. It didn't inherit the dualisms that made disenchantment metaphysically necessary. Its native epistemology is experimental rather than dogmatic. So Mormon theology was already on the far side of the problem that Charles Taylor describes. However, Mormonism's metaphysics make it re-enchantment ready. They do not by themselves complete the project. Mormonism alone leaves the re-enchantment in the mode of promise, something we're waiting for, something that will be accomplished in some future we have not yet entered. And what Mormon transhumanism adds is what makes the promise actionable, present tense, and intellectually continuous with what we already know about the world from science. So I want to share 4 ideas. The first one is this: re-enchantment is engineering, not just nostalgia. Most re-enchantment projects ask you to recover a way of seeing, to remember the world was enchanted, our ancestors knew things we've forgotten, some older mode of perception could be restored if we adjusted ourselves rightly. And I think there's something important and partly correct about this instinct. Our ancestors did experience things in a way that we've lost. The cosmologies of pre-modern peoples, everyone who's ever taken the world to be alive, were not naive mistakes that science has now corrected. They were perceptions of something real that the disenchantment story has trained us not to see. And we're right to want what they had and to grieve its loss. The connection to the past is more than just mere sentimentality. Mormon transhumanism inverts this recovery instinct without dishonoring it. Because the cosmos that our ancestors revered was itself unfinished. They were not seeing a golden age behind us that we've fallen away from. They were seeing the early light of a cosmos that is still being made. They were among its makers, and so are we. The recovery and the projection are the same arc, and we are called to remember forward. The world will become more enchanted because conscious agents, our ancestors, us, our descendants, and whoever else is out there doing the same work are making it so. Theosis is a process. Compassion scales. The trajectory of intelligence in the cosmos is plausibly toward more meaning rather than less. And the new God argument is the technical articulation of this, as most of you already know. Now I want to talk about the experiential upshot of this. So disenchantment was always a snapshot of an unfinished cosmos. So the world looked dead because we are early. The second idea is this. The natural-supernatural distinction is collapsing. Now, we already talked about how Joseph Smith collapses this in a religious sense, but it's collapsing from the technological side. Disenchantment depended on this clean line between what nature does on its own and what would require supernatural miracles. And modern technology has been erasing that line for centuries. Mormon transhumanism names what is happening. Sufficiently advanced compassion is indistinguishable from grace. Sufficiently advanced engineering is indistinguishable from creation. Sufficiently advanced charity is indistinguishable from sealing. So what we called supernatural was always about capabilities that we're just beginning to understand. The line didn't mark a metaphysical boundary, but it was about the edge of our competence. And Mormon theology already had the conceptual room to absorb this because it never put God on the other side of nature in the first place. The third thing, teleology is back. Teleology means purpose, the idea that the universe has a direction and a purpose. It's back. And pragmatism is what makes this livable. So I mentioned before, Whitehead, Pierce, Nagel, and others. They've made it intellectually respectable again to treat meaning, mind, and purpose as features of reality rather than just projections onto it. Final causes, meaning the purpose, the reason why something exists, are no longer something a serious philosopher of science has to be embarrassed about. Now, these philosophers reopen the door, but most of them hesitate to walk through it. I think Nagel in particular in his Mind and Cosmos. But Mormon transhumanism walks through. We say that telos is not abstract. It has a name. And for Mormon transhumanists, that name is Christ. It has a face, and we've seen it, or rather it has many faces, past, present, and future, because the point of Christ is that what happened in him is happening in varying measure in all of us, as Doctrine and Covenants 93 articulates. And here's what keeps all of this intellectually honest. Pragmatism makes this livable. So our Mormon transhumanist claim about a compassionate post-human future is not a metaphysical assertion that demands our assent. It is a hypothesis that we're authorized to live by because of the difference that it makes to our ethics, to our work, to our perception, and to the kinds of beings that we become in trying to bring it about. This is Peirce's pragmatic maxim, William James's will to believe applied to eschatology. And it's also Moroni 10 applied to the future instead of to the past. Try it and see what it produces in you and through you. Mormon transhumanism is the only re-enchantment project I know of that can affirm rigorous material ontology, irreducible teleology, embodied divinity, and personal eschatology. And it can hold all of these together because it holds them pragmatically and not dogmatically. Now, a skeptic at this point might say, well, this is just sort of a fancy, sophisticated way of projecting human hopes onto the universe. And that's a fair challenge. But to be honest, that's the faith assumption of the new God argument. Yes, the pragmatist answer is direct. The claim is not that this is true in advance of anything that we do or in advance of any test. The claim is that this is the stance that produces the most truth in practice, the most love, the most attention, the most useful work towards the kind of cosmos that could vindicate it. You don't get to know in advance. You get to live as if and watch what you become and watch what the world becomes through you. This is not projection, it's participation. And as I've previously said in a conference talk, the best prophecy is one that is self-fulfilling. Fourth idea, the porous self. Remember, I asked you to hold on to that porous self. This is that pre-modern self that was open to the world and vulnerable to it and constituted by what flowed through it from outside. And disenchantment in large part is the story of how that got walled off and became the buffered self. The self that meaning has to be imported into because the world doesn't bring it. But here's something that Mormon transhumanism can do that almost no other re-enchantment project can. It can give us back that porous self without asking us to be pre-modern. Adam Miller, who keynoted one of our conferences a number of years ago, has done some really great philosophical work here. He wrote a book called Speculative Grace. And in this, he presents a very novel and very Mormon take on object-oriented ontology. So this is a recent metaphysical approach that basically treats every object as porous to every other. That means that objects have boundaries, but those boundaries can be crossed and they're flexible. And so objects are constituted by what they receive as much as by what they give. And on Miller's view, grace is not some supernatural divine intrusion into a closed natural order, but grace is the ordinary givenness, the interconnectedness and givenness of things that we almost never even notice because it's so close, so constant. And in recent Mormon discourse, we've begun to rediscover this concept. That divine grace is something that empowers us in everything that we do, not something that gets added once we've exhausted all of our own resources. This is the porous self that's described in terms that a contemporary philosopher can defend. And this is also the metaphysics that Mormonism has held all along. Intelligences are eternal and in eternal relation, sealed to one another across an open cosmos. And Mormon transhumanism supplies what the ontology can't by itself. It supplies the ethical and the practical upshot. So if the self is genuinely porous, that is, if I'm constituted by what flows through me from the cosmos and the community and my dead and my descendants, then my ethical situation changes. Because I'm not an isolated, buffered self doing things to a world. I become a site at which the world is becoming more or less compassionate, more or less intelligent, more or less divine. Theosis is not something that just happens to an isolated soul. Theosis is what the porous self is for. And this changes my ethical situation. The scope of my moral concern extends in time. I become accountable not just for my generated acts, but for what I'm transmitting from the community and the cosmos and my dead and the unborn that I'm bound to. So just take a concrete example. When I pass along a prejudice that I've inherited without examining it, I'm not just making a private moral error. I'm failing in a custodial role because I'm transmitting damage forward into a community that extends beyond what I can see. When I recover a lost ancestor story and I tell it truthfully, I'm not just performing a hobby, but I'm doing a repair work on a connection that the cosmos depends on. This porous self can't outsource accountability to the past or defer it to the future, because the past and future are flowing through us right now. And ordinary objects and encounters take on a moral weight as well, because how I treat these is how I'm participating in the cosmos becoming more or less compassionate, more or less intelligent, more or less divine. And so nothing I do is merely local. And so then there's the pragmatist test. Does living as a porous self in a re-enchanted cosmos actually make us better? Does it make us kinder, more attentive? Are we more capable of love? Are we doing more towards the project of universal exaltation? And if yes, that is the warrant of its truth, not metaphysical certainty. Faithful experiment. So what does that look like in practice? A lot of philosophy. So the invitation of this talk is to a way of seeing. I'm going to give you 3 small examples of what that way of seeing might look like. I would encourage you to find and recognize your own examples. Consider a genealogical record. A name, a couple of dates, a place. A disenchanted reading of this is that this is merely data. But a Mormon transhumanist reading of this is a person whose intelligence is uncreated and eternal, whose story is unfinished, and whose reconciliation with the whole, by us, by our descendants, by God, is part of the work that the cosmos is for. So the record is not just a trace of someone who's gone. It's a thread that we're pulling on. Or think of a piece of running code. As mentioned, I'm a software developer. So I write a function, right? A set of instructions that didn't exist until I thought of it. And I hand it to silicon and electricity, and it executes. Matter does what mind asked it to. And this is not just a metaphor for creation. It's a small, literal instance of creation. Something that was not is now something that is, because we willed it and shaped it. And in a cosmos where doing exactly that at sufficient scale and with sufficient compassion, this is an example of creation, not exhaustive, of course. This is what gods do. And so a small act of creation is practice for the real thing. And maybe most importantly, look at a human being across from you and see them not as a meat machine running prediction algorithms, but also not just as a spirit temporarily wearing flesh. An eternal, embodied, mid-exaltation person in whose future you are implicated and who is implicated in yours. This is part of what it means to see as Christ sees and to participate in the eternal work of atonement. My invitation is not for you to believe new things. It is to let yourself perceive the things you already half believe, and then to test that perception pragmatically in the Jamesian sense. Live as if and watch what you become. And then find ways to give that perception to others, not just by argument, but by how you treat the record, the code, the person. 20 years ago, I helped found this association because I thought we were going to integrate faith and science. And we are still doing that work, and I'm proud of it. But what I discovered along the way is that something else was happening at the same time. Something I didn't initially expect and that I didn't initially have words for. The world was opening to me. My eyes were being opened. The same way that Elisha prayed for his servant 20 some odd years ago when Lincoln answered yes to that question about seeing angels. The world is not disenchanted. It's early. But even in this early stage, for those with eyes to see, it is full of signs and wonders. The cosmos is calling you to be Christ. And what it becomes, what new signs and wonders will arise, depend in large part on what we choose to build into it.